It's a welcome and good evening from me, Simon Forrest. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm your principal here at Hillbead. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us this evening for what I'm sure will be a really interesting and stimulating in conversation with. So I just got a couple of kind of administrative things to say about how we'll run, and then introduce our guest and our interview, if that's okay. So the kind of housekeeping things are as such. We ask if that's okay if people are happy to pop the mute on while it's taking place. Just cuts down a bit. Excuse me. It cuts down a bit on the feedback we can sometimes get in the Zoom environment. And in terms of how we'll run, we'll probably go half an hour, 30, 35 minutes, kind of go with the flow a bit, seeing how Stella and Eleanor are going. And then I'm going to suggest at that point, when it feels like we get a natural, we'll take a bit of a break, particularly to let them draw breath, and then come back into the room. And if everybody's amenable, we can open the floor up and take questions more generally that might arise from discussion or things that have brought you here this evening. So I hope that's okay. So I'd really like, therefore, to introduce both our special guest tonight and our interviewer. So perhaps I might start with our guest, if that's okay, and that's Dr. Eleonore Fournier Tombs. So Eleanor's an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Law, and also coordinates the research chair on accountable AI, so artificial intelligence in a global context. So she lectures at McGill and a number of other places and consults on disaster risk prediction at the World Bank. So while her academic work has largely focused on automated methods for the measurement of political deliberation in the Canadian North and social media and the impacts of emerging technologies on migrants and other vulnerable populations. So we're really at the front edge here of kind of thinking about the new environments in which people are living and working and experiencing their lives. But Eleanor's, a very eminent figure outside those academic circles. So in addition to her relationship work with the World Bank, she's worked for the Human Development Report Office at the UN, and is also a recipient of the United Nations Secretary General Award, I think in recognition of that portfolio of work and a number of policy reports on data and modelling for the United Nations. And she's currently the area editor for Data and Policy Journal, so Cambridge University Press Journal. And somehow in amongst all that, I understand that you've got two boys as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to say also a huge thank you and introduce you to Stella, who's sitting rather neatly, respectively, on my right and left. So Stella Baricic is a student colleague of ours, so third year in PPE, Politics, Philosophy, Economics, and comes originally from Slovenia. She has a particular interest in politics and foreign affairs, and is looking, I think, to think about postgraduate work and possibly employment in those areas. I think the other things I wanted to say about Stella is what an extraordinary and brilliant member of college she is. She's always been a bit of a beacon of light and kindness towards me personally, always somebody prepared to stop and have a conversation, and is an extraordinarily important leader and role model for many people in relation to activities across the college, but I particularly point to in terms of Hillbead Boat Club and rugby, which you play for the university, I think, as well, Stella. So we're delighted to have you here. We thank you for giving the time and the energy and commitment to think of some really interesting things to ask Eleanor about her life and work and career, and we look forward to that for the next half an hour or so. So if that's okay, excuse me, I'm really short of breath. I'm going to hand over to Stella and say thank you for leading us in conversation with Eleanore Fournier Tombs. Over to you, Stella.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction for both of us. I think what you've spoken about, Eleanor's sort of CV, and I think we can all agree it's very impressive. And I think the first question that I'd like to ask is, was the career that you've had not planned, because obviously things come into life and they go, but when you were still a student, when you were, let's say, in my position, how did you envisage your career would go, and where did you think you would end up compared to looking back?
Thanks, Stella, and thank you also to Simon for the introduction, and it's really nice to meet everyone virtually, so thank you for having me. In terms of my career so far, so I do think that it looks a lot more cohesive in hindsight that it felt or that it has felt over the last 15 years or so. I did study political science at McGill, and my program was quite similar to the PPE program at Durham, and I did my bachelor's there. I wanted to do some work in international development from the beginning, so that's definitely something that interested me. I never would have imagined that I would have worked at the UN, but I did start working in local international development organizations in Montreal to start getting experience. And, you know, throughout the course of the last 15 years, I've probably applied to hundreds of different jobs. And it just happened that, you know, there was more, the UN ended up being more receptive in a sense. After I finished my master's, I did a master's in sustainable development, and then I started working on a second master's in information science, and that helped to kind of position me at a crossroads between information technology and international development, which is an area that really interests me a lot. And through that, I got an internship at the UN, and that kind of started me along that path of working in international organizations, which I found to be quite interesting and diverse. So I would say that it's really hard to plan ahead of time. I think it's something that I've always been interested in. And so I'm really grateful to have been able to work in this area. But I don't know exactly what I was expecting when I first started, but it's certainly not this.
So maybe because you've worked for the UN and the World Bank, well, you're still currently working for the World Bank, both very prominent, big organizations, like global. What do you think have been the main challenges working in such organizations? Or maybe how do you think the work that you've done with them has different from any expectations that you might have had before you started?
Well, these are very, very big bureaucracies. There's a lot of, it's very complex organizations, and there's a lot of staff members. And I think that it's always good to bear in mind that these organizations that function very similarly to working maybe for, you know, the British government or the Canadian government, in that it's challenging to get things done. It's a little bit conservative, and things move kind of slowly. So I think that knowing that ahead of time helps in terms of being patient, maybe flexible. I've worked a little bit in other kinds of organizations, whether it's smaller nonprofits or I had a small stint in a tech company in New York, and definitely moved more quickly. And you could feel that you had more of an impact on a smaller company. So I think what I've loved about the UN and the World Bank work is that these are big global issues. And so it's fascinating. And it's very international. So you meet people from everywhere around the world, which is great. But it's kind of slow and bureaucratic also. And I think it's good to just know that, so that, you know, to be able to expect that when you go into it.
Yeah, I think a lot of students maybe, and even me perhaps, but I have a lot of friends who are interested in working for the civil service, as you mentioned, which is also big sort of national bureaucracy, but also international organizations. We go in maybe a bit naively thinking that just because we're working for organizations that are dealing with very big and important issues, we'll have the ability to actually affect these issues. And chances are we very likely will not have that ability, at least in the first years working for them. So I think that's a very important point to stress, I guess.
Well, it's not, I don't want to discourage anyone. It's not exactly, I don't mean that you can't have a positive impact. But it is, you know, something that I've tried to navigate in terms of maintaining a bit of an academic career as well as working for these organizations, in order to have a vehicle for myself to maybe talk a little bit more critically about different issues, or have a little bit of a personal voice. And so that's a little bit of a personal preference, I think, of wanting to explore some things in a little bit more detail that I might not have a chance to do just in doing kind of day-to-day implementation of technologies. But I think that the advantage of working for an organization like this, and that's why I don't want to discourage anyone, is that you do get a lot of exposure. So you're able to see that actually some of these global issues are quite complex, and you start, meeting different people, seeing the operations of different countries or different organizations in this context. And it can be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it definitely can be very rewarding being involved in issues that I guess are very relevant and can have a big impact on a global population. Something that we talked about yesterday when we met sort of before this interview was a disconnect between the organization's mission and the reality of how the bureaucracy within the organization works. And it's something I found very interesting. So if you could talk about that or explain to the audience something more about that.
Sure. So I think what I found is that because it's an organization that in a lot of ways has a lot of very progressive missions, whether it's gender rights, UN Women, protecting children, UNICEF. There's just all of these big, important global issues are being addressed by the United Nations. But at the same time, it's a bureaucracy. And so there's certain issues that are kind of slow to change. I was talking a little bit about, for example, gender rights within the organization. I found it was interesting as a Canadian working in the US, in the New York headquarters, the maternity leave was only 16 weeks, for example, which is very short. It's very long for the US, it's very short for Canada and for Europe. And so there's sometimes been these kinds of tensions where just the way things operate in terms of maybe, maternity leave, paternity leave. There's even a funny story. I was talking about banning smoking inside the UN buildings. So that took a really long time. And it was quite recent that people were still smoking indoors. So there's just some kind of funny anecdotes about how the institution itself is slow moving. And that's because it's so big. And there's so much diversity in terms of different staff members and countries involved and everything. And so it's both very progressive in its ambitions, I think, and also very, very slow. And it's just the way it works.
Yeah. So you mentioned gender equality and maternity leave. And maybe we'd touch the book that you're soon to publish, which is in this field. If you could maybe tell us a bit about this project and what inspired you to tackle it.
Sure. So when the COVID-19 pandemic started, so we started becoming confined in March of last year. One of the issues that I found that really spoke to me was the school closures and the daycare closures, because as I'm a mother of young children, and I also feel very dedicated to what I'm doing professionally, and I felt that it would be very difficult to maintain this kind of pace of work without any kind of support from schools and daycares. Especially because my children are very young, so 2 and 6. So I would have to stop working and take care of them. And it really made me think about the number of women internationally that were in a similar situation, and how, behind they might start becoming in their jobs, whether it's, losing their work or having to take some time off, or just not being able to get a promotion because they weren't able to, deliver the same quality of work. And so probably due to my anxiety surrounding this issue, I kind of started putting it all down on paper. So I didn't work alone. I actually hired 2 research assistants, a woman in Mexico and a woman in the United States, to start doing research on gender norms in work in general. So it's an issue that's, it's been talked about a lot. So I thought I would do a little bit of maybe a different take, a COVID-19 take, and focus especially on North America, so Canada, the US, and Mexico, and just start talking about different maybe facets of this sort of big issue. I think part of it was that I wanted to understand as well, what do we mean when we talk about gender imbalances or gender norms at work? How can we maybe break it down in order to understand? So I started talking about maybe the education system, leadership, technology, so different areas of this problem. And so there's a publisher, independent publisher in Montreal, who was really interested in publishing it in French. So I had to translate it, which was another piece of work. And so now we're in the revision process. And it should be published in September if we're able to get it edited.
I think that's very interesting. I recently, funnily enough, I wrote a short essay on, for my degree, obviously, about time poverty, which is something that maybe people don't consider as much as income poverty or wealth, because it's less noticeable. And the way in which time poverty is especially connected to gender norms. And I think it's a very, very relevant issue. And surprisingly enough, I mean, it's not, I wrote about developing countries, but it's obviously an issue everywhere, not just in countries where some specific gender norms are maybe more obvious than in the West.
Yeah, I think that's it really, just to, continue on this topic of, I love the notion of time poverty. I think it's true for women that generally there's just so many days, so many hours in a day, and it is difficult to conciliate everything. And I think that the idea would be to spread just much more the additional responsibility across genders, in order to free up some thinking space for women. And, for myself, I think I'm in a job where I have to sit down and think and be quiet a lot. And that does not conciliate very well with having very young children. And so that's something to really think about, is how you can think, how you can make time to think. So anyways, I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Sort of leading on from this gender inequality almost, well, not almost, definitely. Do you think you faced any barriers to entry as a woman sort of looking for jobs in big bureaucratic organizations such as the UN, or did you ever experience any kind of discrimination because you're a woman, you think?
Well, it's a good question. It's a bit hard to say. I think that there's balance in everything. So there's definitely people that are extremely welcoming and encouraging, men and women, and there are people that are not so encouraging. And I feel that I started to really think about gender much more when I became a mother. So I don't think I really thought about it as much when I was a student and when I was starting in my career. And so I started to look back and to try to see, had I experienced, discrimination or not. And I would say that it is very varied. Being in the technology sector, I would say that I would be in the minority generally. So in a group of people that do programming, for example, you can expect often about 25% women, mainly. So if you look at numbers in big organizations, and my personal experience in offices, certain fields have less women in them. And the reverse is also true. But in this case, technology, finance also has less women in them. The UN has a lot of very strong female leaders in it. So I think it often comes to maybe specific examples of, more negative situations that might have happened. And then some of the things I may never know, there might be barriers that I would just, were erected, and who knows why, it could be because I didn't have the skills. It could be because I was a young woman, and, you'll never know. But I think that it's actually helpful to start becoming aware of this, maybe also to help yourself, I started, that's why when I wanted to write the book, I hired people to help me. And, when I feel like there's too much, I try to get some, childcare support and things like that. I think once I became aware of how demanding it was to be a mother of young children, and maybe a parent of young children, because it's also demanding for fathers, I started being a little bit more comfortable getting help and support as well. So, yeah.
Do you think, because the UN, let's say, and the World Bank as well, are such international organizations, do you think there's also maybe do you think there are cultural differences because there's so many people coming from different parts of the world? And is there a way that the UN, let's say, makes sure that there's a overarching culture, or how do they manage the different cultures when they clash, for instance? Because I'm sure they do to some extent.
Well, it's a very, very unique environment in the sense that it is completely international. So when I was in New York, my friend group was Iraqi, Jamaican, Europeans, Australians. It's completely mixed. And so I don't know, and I'm speaking here not from a diplomatic or geopolitical level. I'm talking about the staff members that are there all together. And I think people will come in potentially with their different cultural baggage, but there's also a kind of an organizational culture where, there's a huge amount of diversity. And I actually don't see that as a negative thing. I found that probably to be the best part of working in an organization that's so international, is just to be exposed to so many different cultures, and to, in a way, be a representative of your own culture. So, which is, I think a lot of people that work at the UN are like me, who have actually a mixed background. So I'm half French and half Canadian. So I had a bit of a kind of European part and then a Canadian part. Canada's diverse too in terms of language. So you start becoming a little bit more aware of your roots, and sort of learning about other people's background as well. And so I did really enjoy that part.
Yeah, I think it definitely is one of the benefits. And I guess it's the best way of finding solutions to problems is by taking people from various not backgrounds, but from everywhere, to try and bring ideas to the table. Sort of changing the topic completely, onto climate change, which, as I said yesterday, I wrote my dissertation on how climate and conflict interact, and how natural disasters might trigger civil unrest. And you've done research in this field as well. How do you think, what are some of the difficulties of addressing conflict and climate change? And how do you think the UN, let's say, and the Human Development Report, which you've worked on, how do they sort of interact? How do they come into this story? Or what have they done or are doing?
Okay, well, the pathway, the general premise is that climate change increases the occurrence of natural disasters, and that can then create additional pressure on people, especially vulnerable people, and it may lead to additional conflict. Conflict could be surrounding natural resources. So people that are already in a precarious position may find themselves in a way blocked if they need to access water from a certain source, or they only have one location in which to gain food. They might become less autonomous. If they're farmers, for example, they might have to purchase food rather than growing it themselves. So that can be used. So water and food can be used during natural disasters as kind of a tool for war. So people can be blocked from getting water, and that will create a lot of tension. People can be very stressed in terms of their livelihoods and may turn to joining a militia or something like that in order to make ends meet, maybe, or find an alternatives for themselves. So there's kinds of pathways that are discussed about how conflict could increase, and especially local conflicts is what I'm talking about in this case, because of natural disasters. So the UN, when we talk about natural disasters specifically, we're talking more about humanitarian interventions. And so the UN is obliged to both intervene and be neutral. So it can't really have an opinion about, who's causing the conflict or anything like that. It is obliged to attempt to maintain peace in certain cases when it's deployed in that way, and also to intervene in terms of humanitarian aid. So providing the variety of elements that are included in a humanitarian aid intervention, whether it's food, water, basic healthcare, shelter, education for the children. So there's a number of things in which they try to coordinate their interventions. So there's additionally, so that's the response kind of part. The development programs like UNDP, of which the Human Development Report Office is part of, will not really address the response and sort of immediate response to natural disasters. We'll more think about the root causes. So we'll have an environmental and collaborate with the UN Environmental Program to think about, resilience and maybe reversing climate change, although that's more the UN Environmental Program. And so the UNDP will think more about how can people be more resilient so that when there's crises, they don't suffer as much and are not as much in a position of precarity. So finally, the question about the Human Development Report. So that's really there's no intervention. It's really just an annual report published by UNDP, which aims to measure global well-being at a national level. So the Human Development Index is an index which is comprised of education, health, and GDP. And every year, information is compiled for every country, and countries are ranked. The idea behind that is to think about not just economic well-being, but a more multidimensional measure of well-being in countries, maybe to encourage policy in that direction. And since its creation, the UNDP has thought about other measures, not just education and health, but also they have something called multidimensional poverty. They have a gender index and so on. So they try to address these elements. And so I think that's not so much in terms of climate change prevention, but that's more in terms of resilience building. So there's just there's interventions in these kinds of things at so many different levels. And I think they're inserting themselves at more of a resilience level in terms of these crises.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, what do you think the role of the World Bank is in sort of helping developing and developed countries sort of level out? Because I know that the World Bank is heavily involved in obviously trying to minimize poverty and things like that. And it also has more maybe like tangible things that it does compared to the UN.
So the World Bank is a bank, and it's really responsible for giving loans, mostly a little bit of grants, to developing countries. And it focuses a lot on building infrastructure and sort of development projects in different countries. So in this specific context, it's very involved in measuring, thinking about natural disasters. Even to a certain extent, it's a little bit more, it thinks the agency can think about conflict a little bit more, because it doesn't have the same obligation of neutrality that a UN intervention might have. But its role would be more in terms of providing financial support to countries and also advice. The countries themselves will have a little bit more agency in terms of what they're asking for and what the development infrastructure projects end up being. Whereas the UN would intervene as the UN into a specific country, the World Bank would be more likely to work through national government in order to maybe build specific infrastructures that would help in either natural disaster, climate adaptation, mitigation, again, in these kinds of realms, and a bit of response, but less. It's more development. And this is also a thing, is that development and international development and humanitarian aid are a little bit split. So they have they have different organizations working on those things. So immediate response will be one organization, and then the more longer term perspective will be a different organization. And so the World Bank is thinking more about longer term perspective.
And how do you think the pandemic might have or has affected sort of the efforts of the World Bank and the UN in both in tackling climate change and sort of vulnerability of underdeveloped countries to natural disaster, climate-induced disasters, things like that? Do you think these things have maybe been put aside because of the pandemic, or?
I actually wouldn't say that. I think that what is in a way very extraordinary about the pandemic is that it really brought everyone together on a common issue. No matter where you are, this is really top of mind in terms of a global priority. And it seems to me that it also brought it highlighted issues of global inequality and climate change. So additional major global issues are also being highlighted due to COVID-19, because those that suffered most from the pandemic were those that were already in positions of vulnerability. And that's one issue. And then the other issue is whether climate change would increase the number of potential future epidemics. And I think everybody's asking themselves those questions. So in a way, it's a very interesting time because everybody around the world is sort of focalized on these same issues. And so I've felt, and this is just a personal opinion, but I felt that there's been a lot of energy around global crises recently. And that there's a lot of work, there's a lot of people publishing and thinking about things and collaborating in a way that was maybe less apparent before the pandemic. So while it's been a really horrible tragedy, and I think that, a lot of people have suffered a lot, it's been very difficult. I think that in terms of longer term perspectives on inequality and climate change, it may have helped people really focus on them more than they might have a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think as a student or as a member of a younger or a certain generation or population, I think I've definitely felt that as well, that during the past year, maybe we've reflected more on certain issues that before we sort of could avoid, but now have become too apparent, such as you say, inequality, climate change. Also, I think COVID and highlighted this time poverty that we discussed beforehand with care work and things like that being sort of gender specific, I guess. So I think we're going to like bring this to a close with a question that I'm personally interested in, and I don't know if there are any students in the audience, but I think it's relevant for anyone looking at pursuing a career such as yours, well, in international organizations and in academia as well. But do you have any advice for students who have decided this the career path they want to follow? Any specific internships, or would you advise internships? In what way do you think such a working for the UN could be best achieved, let's say? I don't know.
Okay. Well, there are internships. So the UN has a lot of internships that open up for master's students, or at least at that level. I think PhD students as well. There's also this this idea that the staff at the UN have to be balanced in terms of country representation. So a number of countries have YPP program. It's Young Professionals Program. And that means that every year they do exams. And so if you pass the exam, you can become a staff member, you get rostered and you can become a staff member at the UN. So these are some of the kind of direct channels to get into this kind of work. I think that generally it's a bit hard to imagine at the beginning of one's career, but keep working on these issues and start signaling that you're interested in working in them. I think that that's probably how I ended up working in this field, is just a little bit at a time. So just having one internship, having a few months. I had a contract for 3 months once at UNICEF, little bits at a time, and then it starts to make sense. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and these are very interesting and kind of important areas to work in. International organizations are not the only places to do very interesting international development work. There's lots of different NGOs. There's work being done by government agencies as well. And there's the Red Cross. So there's a lot of, so it's good to also have a kind of a varied perspective, because careers are long. And I mean, I've only been working for 15 years. So, I'm not done yet, I think. But I think, there's no, just making one decision and taking one position doesn't mean that you can't change later. And so I would say that, to try to cast a broad net and to keep going with what you're interested in doing. There's no reason why it wouldn't work.
That's good to hear. Yeah, thank you very much for now, I think. Simon's going to take over.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Stella. Thanks, Eleanor. This is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I've got 100 questions already. What I'm going to suggest is, if that's okay, that we just allow people to check out, particularly you two, with our thanks right now, but we'll do that properly at the end. So just to check out for a few minutes, take a breath, and then come back. Stella, it might be that there is opportunity to come back with some more questions, but I think what I'd like to do as well is open up the floor, if that's okay. So, what are we at now? 12 minutes past the hour. So I don't know. Should we aim for kind of 5 minutes? Be back at about 17 minutes past, and then we'll see what we've got either from the floor or come back to you, Stella, if that's okay. So we'll see everybody in just 5. Welcome back. I'm just glad to see everybody back with us. So thanks again to Eleanor and Stella for such a really interesting and engaging conversation. I'd now like, as I said, for the next 10 or 12 minutes, we can open up the floor or give it back to Stella if she's got some more questions. So can I invite, is there anybody out there who's got something they'd like to ask or raise with Eleanor, perhaps reflect on with her? Okay, it's very quiet of everybody. Stella, have you got another opportunity if you want one? I've got a question, but let you go, because I know you've got more.
No, I'll let you go first, and then we'll.
Oh, okay. So my one, Eleanor, is about I'm sorry, because it's really about your experience of being, I think, in these two extraordinary environments, the United Nations and the World Bank. Um, and and I feel like we've got quite up close to some of the sense of a little bit about how they feel as organisations. Now, they've been through, some really tough times recently, it seems to me, with much more divisive kind of geopolitics in many ways, into which a pandemic and increased global kind of crisis has stepped. From your professional perspective, has that affected, the ways that the organisations are functioning, in terms of the relationships with them, and perhaps the kind of role you've had to play in a more stressful environment?
So do you mean in terms of addressing global issues or more issues within the UN, kind of geopolitical issues in terms of how the UN is perceived?
I think a bit of both, really, because that's what I wondered. I mean, is that kind of? I wondered if the two, perhaps they're very separate. That's a really interesting observation. But I wonder if they did feel kind of interlocked a bit. The way it functioned as an organisation and the way it perceived. Perhaps they're disjunctured. Perhaps it's been working smoothly and brilliantly, but from the outside, it looks like the world's a really much more dangerous place than it's been for a long time. Much more. What do you think?
Well, I don't, there's so many different answers to that. I think one of the things is, so the UN is, and I'm speaking more about the UN because I actually have a lot more experience working at the UN. So I'm so much more familiar with the way it works. And I think that, it's a pretty complex organization, and in terms of governance as well, there's a lot of issues. It's I think that it's kind of important to have international government, but it's very challenging. In terms of the international environment, so there's several challenges. I think in terms of global issues outside of the UN, such as COVID or climate change, as we talked about, these may be, they enhance the mission of the UN because it makes people more focused, and it makes the work that they're doing feel more important. The UN might get more funding in order to conduct different operations. It sort of dynamizes the organization in a way. There's other challenges. So perceptions of the UN can become a challenge, particularly when it relates to sort of diplomatic opposition or funding withdrawal. So there was a threat having the US withdraw from the WHO. That has a huge impact, not only in terms of the legitimacy of the organization, because the US is such a big global power, but also practically, because once funding is withdrawn, it's more difficult to kind of operate. And UNESCO recently suffered from that when the US withdrew from funding from UNESCO. And so it struggled a lot in terms of ensuring that it had enough funding to maintain its operations. So I think the funding element is a challenge. There is part of the UN that's called core funding that gets funded and kind of approved by the General Assembly, and that happens with each country giving a contribution. And there's other parts that have to fundraise in order to operate. So the office that I worked for more recently at OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, was all kind of outside of the budget. So they had to fundraise and raise budget just like any nonprofit for a few years at a time in order to have operations. So in a way, the more internationally human beings believe in the UN and want their national governments to prioritize the work of the UN, the more there's budget and kind of energy put in the UN for it to be able to do its work. So that's I think that's some maybe partial answer to some of the issues that you were raising. I don't know if it addresses all of it though.
Thank you, Anna. It wasn't very forensic of me. Sorry, it wasn't very helpful. So can I come back round again and then maybe come back to Stella if nobody else has got a question? Does anybody else want to come in at this point? Okay, I'm going to pop. Steph, were you going to? Sorry.
I believe Jamie has a question. Jamie, would you
Hi,
like to ask your question?
Thank you, Steph. Yeah, and hello, everybody. By the way, most of you don't know me. I'm a part-time PhD student. I'm not actually a Hillbead student, but I heard about this and thought it'd be really interesting. So I've got a question about kind of it's a question about the it's a kind of a career question, I guess. So obviously you work in World Bank now, you have worked for the UN, you've got your academic interests all the way through that. Working for an organization like the UN or the World Bank, do you ever find, I imagine that working for institutions like that, you have to a certain degree, operate in quite a politically neutral way. So when you're providing your expertise, your professional insight, your academic knowledge, is it ever a challenge to make sure you act in a very kind of politically neutral way? I'm asking that question because I'm a part-time PhD student, but I'm also a UK civil servant. My day job is in the civil service, and certainly the UK civil service puts a great deal of emphasis on being politically neutral, being professionals who advise government, who support government programs, who do whatever government wants to do. You've kind of talked about how at the UN, various different political issues from outside the organization affect its funding, its legitimacy, things like that. Are there ever any challenges to people actually working for the institution to make sure they're seen as impartial, politically neutral actors? I hope that question makes some kind of sense.
Of course, it makes complete sense. So the reason that I'm able to have, more detail in this conversation now is because I'm not a staff member. So I am a consultant right now. When you're a staff member, like a civil servant, you're a representative of the organization. And so you do have some political obligations in terms of just not joining a political party. So that's one of the things that we wouldn't do. You wouldn't want to speak on the behalf of the United Nations. You're kind of seen as you're a diplomat, actually. So you have diplomatic status, and you have to kind of be careful in terms of what you express in terms of personal opinions. So it's like any civil servant. It's international civil service is the same thing. So one of the reasons that I moved to consultant work more recently is just to have a little bit more freedom. I wanted to try to see working academically in these themes. It would be challenging to have more of a kind of a critical research perspective while being a staff member. So at the beginning of my PhD, when I was still a staff member, I researched a topic a little bit different. I talked about political deliberation and something that was not really related to the international development work that I was doing. Now that I'm trying to combine both and really research and speak on the issue of technology in an international context, it is helpful for me to have a little bit of a step back and not be a staff member. So that's not to say I don't think that they necessarily preclude each other. It doesn't mean that I can't ever go back to that position, but I think when you're in a diplomatic position, you are a little bit limited in terms of what you're able to express. So I think it's a question of also personal preference.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie, for that great question. And so missed you. And what a nice answer. I don't know. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. Does anybody else want to come in? Otherwise, I'm going to give Stella the chance to ask a final question. Okay, Stella, do you want to have a go? Do you want one more question? You're really welcome if you've got something there.
It might be a bit connected to the question that was asked before Jamie's question. But do you think with increasing nationalism and sort of a divisiveness in the world, do you think organizations such as the UN, or let's say in Europe, I've definitely noticed the European Union, you think such international bodies are losing political legitimacy in a way because of countries maybe becoming more insular, or because of all of the issues that we've had with the pandemic and inequality and things like that?
Well, I mean, I'm in favor of multilateralism and international governance. I think it's really important. I think that sometimes we think that things were a little bit more smooth sailing in the past, in the sense that I think that the UN has always faced a lot of challenges. The first iteration, the League of Nations, dissolved pretty quickly. And there's, I think, been a lot of, it's been, there's a lot of countries involved. There's a lot of debates and discussions. I'm not to say that we don't often feel that these organizations are under threat, and of course with the European Union and Brexit, there are some real impacts. But I do think that I wouldn't expect that there would be a time when these kinds of modes of governance would not be questioned. And so I don't know what the future holds, but I would hope that there will be other people might be opposed, and there might be some more nationalist or populist, whether it's politicians or even different kinds of figures that don't agree with this kind of international government. And I would hope that there's also other people that think it's a good idea and that keep working towards it. So I think it's when you look at the history of the UN, you see that this kind of questioning and self-reflection happens actually all the time. So maybe it helps keep the organization a little bit more relevant. I don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think that we're always trying to figure out how to best do this. And it's kind of a complex issue, and it's by no means being done perfectly right now. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic about it, but I think that there's definitely a lot of space for people to also come up with either new solutions or maybe re-energize these kinds of international initiatives.
Brilliant. What a great question, Stella. What a lovely way to close the evening, right? With a kind of sense of what I would call realistic optimism. both, I don't know, from the point of view of why it's important, as well as just that really helpful memory that it's never easy to put people together from, a variety of different perspectives, whether that's nationally, geopolitically, or otherwise. But that there are important moments and places and times when that becomes even more necessary. And clearly, we're seeing some of those now. So that's a kind of beautiful way to wrap things up, it feels to me. So thank you for that. And I just want to say a huge thank you, particularly to Eleanor, for giving us her time today to do this. What a special gift it is when somebody comes, and even though Zoom gives us this kind of proximity, I mean, the reality is, making time in an extraordinarily busy working schedule to come and share that experience, those personal reflections with us, and that kind of sense of kinship. Thank you. And to Stella for stellar questions, if I might say so. They shone, which is what stars should do. And they were insightful, but also, they're kind of in that amicable way that the best questions do. They just draw somebody out. And so thank you for doing that. And a huge thank you to Steph for organising it and everybody for coming. We've captured this, so we will be able to enable more people to share our hope in the wisdom and thought that we've enjoyed this evening. So it's a thank you to everybody for coming, and particularly to Eleanor and Stella. And good night, everybody. Good night.
Night.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Stella. These were wonderful questions. It was a pleasure to meet you, and it was a pleasure to speak to you all.